My name's Ian Edward Brown. I was born in Alnwick and lived at Leamoor Farm at Rennington during the whole of the 80s and beyond. And I was aged between 15 and 25 during the period of the 1980s.
Please can you tell us about your social life during the 1980s?
My social life in the 1980s, I guess I would be 15 when it all started. Social life was away in Harrogate, where I was sent away to be a boarder at a boarding school called Asheville College. And I guess because of that, I didn't know many people locally. And really that didn't change till I was 18 and I came back home and I became a young farmer. And once I'd become a young farmer, I met a lot of other young farmers, and that involved quite a huge social life. So I guess from age 18, when I was working on a local farm, I then had a really good social life with those other people just like me.
Did you go out in Alnwick?
We did. I think we were lucky being young farmers in the 1980s that we had cars where not everybody did back in the 1980s. Cars were still a bit of a luxury for young people, although insurance was probably cheaper. Then I think the fact was cars themselves were more expensive, but I think most of us worked on farms or were sons and daughters of farmers, and that kind of dictated the social life. So we did used to travel all around the county of Northumberland, and one of the crazy things we used to do was we used to drink at Chatton. Pubs then closed at 10:30, so it was very limited drinking hours. We'd quite often have the munchies, and there just wasn't as many fast food outlets as there are today. So quite often we'd just jump in our cars, speed up to Edinburgh, get a pizza. I'd normally grab a copy of the Scotsman newspaper, and my parents would wake up the next morning with a pizza box in the bin and a copy of the Scotsman on the table, and they could never figure out how an Edinburgh newspaper got to be on the table of Rennington Farm for first thing in the morning. But anyway, they wouldn't have understood.
Do you think the pubs in Alnwick, have they changed a great deal? Do you still go out in Alnwick?
I think they have. I mean, I think the numbers of pubs, I think thinking back to the day, I can't remember what the exact number is, but Alnwick was always known for having a lot of pubs for the population. The population has probably doubled in the Alnwick area since the 1980s, and the number of pubs stayed pretty static. So I think there was a huge number of pubs. There was quite a drinking culture, and as young farmers, we would whiz around to a lot of, in our fast souped-up XR2Is, XR3Is, Alfa Romeos, and I think there was quite a strong kind of drinking culture. A lot of the pubs then were drinking pubs. Some of them did a little bit of food, but food wasn't the way that they made their money. So pubs really were drinking dens and places. There was somewhere called the Duke's Club, and the only people who used to drink late in there were Alnwick CID, the senior police officers, and people like us from the young farmers. And it kind of was a very different time. And some things were more lax, and so happy days. Went to very few pop concerts. By the time I was 21, my father had died and left me the farm and the overdraft that went with it. So I think probably I joined Britannia Music, and I used to get newfangled CDs sent to me. And but Queen, having just seen Bohemian Rhapsody, which obviously a whole new generation of young people are now understanding Queen and the history of Queen as a band. Watching that film, I was thinking, where was I in 79? Where was I in 85? Live Aid was absolutely, I was up in Scotland. So having done a year working on the farms around Alnwick for the Jackson family, I then moved up to Edinburgh for a year in college, and then up to Fife in Scotland. 1985 was a wet, horrible year to be farming. And I remember sitting on a tractor, as I was for many moments in history, having been a farmer, and listening to Live Aid on the radio and realising what a big event was happening live in London and in Philadelphia. And I think a lot of people, it's one of those moments, people who lived through the 80s, Live Aid is something very important. Queen had a really important role, and fascinating to watch Bohemian Rhapsody and kind of understand the backstory for Queen in actually being there and playing. So yeah, it's. But music gigs, there wasn't. I don't remember ever going to any gigs locally. I think there was a lot less opportunity, both in terms of cinema, live music, the arts generally. And I think that people have more opportunity now in Alnwick than they did in the 80s.
So, did you remember any films in the 80s that stand out to you that you remember going to see? Because there used to be.
Definitely, yes. I mean, a Top Gun must have been Wall Street. There must have been a couple of very classic Ferris Bueller's Day Out. There must have been a few very classic 80s. I went to see Top Gun in Morpeth. There was a cinema in Morpeth, so I remember absolutely, quite vividly, with my girlfriend, who later became my wife, and going to see that particular film. And interesting because they're about to make a remake, well, not a remake, but a kind of follow-on film. So yeah.
What about TV shows? Is there any that you remember watching?
There was a lot of Dukes of Hazzard in my blood in those days. I think the Young Farmers. Dukes of Hazzard was timed just on a Saturday night before we went out. The timing was very bad in terms of encouraging us to drive sensibly. So Dallas, I was a big Dallas fan. Dynasty less so. So there was a few very classic 80s television programs trying to think whether Only Fools and Horses. Blackadder was actually filmed in the Alnwick area. Blackadder 1 and 2, possibly during the 80s. And I know of local people who provided horses and extras and straw and all sorts of things to the film crew. And Rowan Atkinson was a lot less well known then, but definitely the first two episodes of Blackadder, the first two series, were actually filmed in Alnwick. And of course with a Percy link into the character plot as well.
What kind of hobbies did you have in the 80s?
I think because I was at 21, I was running a business. I didn't have a huge amount of time for hobbies as such. I tried to do as much travel as I could, but again, everything was kind of linked to farming and to young farmers. So in the 80s, I got to about 8 months after my father died. My mother said, "You're probably going to have to be back home working for the rest of your life, so why don't you do a little bit of travel?" So with 8 other young farmers, I actually travelled for 7 whole weeks with a round-the-world ticket and went to New Zealand to look at farming in New Zealand. And then, twist of fate, my son 30 years later has also been to New Zealand to work on farms. I was there for just a short time, and to understand a little bit about farming in New Zealand. We visited Australia, but also America, went up the Twin Towers when the Twin Towers was there to go up, and we did some travelling. One of the funny anecdotes about that was on the beach on Waikiki, we were, as 7 farmers from Northumberland, the whitest people they'd probably ever seen. And they couldn't quite understand how we'd had no hair on our legs from the calves down to our ankles. But when you wear wellies, the wellies wear the hair off the back of your legs. So the reason that it looked like somebody had taken wax strips and taken our hair off our legs was actually purely because we were farmers and we'd spent our lives wearing wellies. So people also, because we had T-shirts with YFC on, Americans used to think that we were members of a football club. They go, "Gee, are you guys members of a football club?" Because we would all be quite big guys, wearing T-shirts with FC on. We'd have to go, no.
What sport did you watch football or support any team?
Again, I was a terribly boring teenager, so I avoided sport. And it's one of the reasons that now that I'm 53, I can still dance on a dance floor and my joints all work, is because I avoided, like a lot of my friends who were big rugby players. So I always knocked around with the rugby guys. So Alnwick Rugby Club at the time, Frosty and a whole lot of characters who were legends and still are legends. I very much grew up around those guys, and I remember the farmhouse was renovated by the Duke. We were tenants of the Duke of Northumberland, and we had a housewarming, and the whole rugby club, first 15, gate crashed the housewarming. There was beer everywhere, and it was a very good party. But yeah, so the rugby club lads were very much kind of in my social circle, but I managed to avoid all sporting injuries by singing with them, but drinking with them, but not playing sport with them. I don't remember. We used to, well, people still call it New Year's Eve, Hogmanay, Old Year's Night. House parties used to happen then, and it was normally somebody's turn to host that. There's a whole load of things that were very minor back then that are big now, like Halloween. Halloween wasn't much of an issue back in the day, but it used to be baggy lanterns back in the day, so there was none of this big orange American thing going on. It was all baggies and turnips. So I think parties were more, you wouldn't preload, you would just go out to the pub, and because pubs closed at 10:30 and there was a bell that rang, and occasionally you get a lock-in, so young farmers were quite infamous to heading up to Holy Island and making sure that we got there as the tide was coming in and getting a good lock-in. So back in the day, if you wanted a late drink, Holy Island was a very, very good place to get to, although getting back was sometimes a bit more tricky. Trying to get somebody to stay sober, and the mist on the causeway, and there was a few nights when we struggled to find the mainland again, but like all good racing pigeons, we always got home in the end.
What did you think of right to buy?
The right to buy as a tenant farmer, it's not something it never really crossed my thinking, because we never had the right to buy as a tenant farmer. Although ironically, 20 years after the 80s, I was in a tenanted house of the Duke, and he did actually give me the offer to buy that property at the going rate. It had a big impact in some of the villages that I became a councillor for years later, because obviously the number of properties for local people diminished, and people who did have the right to buy sold them on as holiday homes. So I think it has had a negative effect on some of the local villages, and I guess some of that probably started in the 1980s. So it has had an impact on the community. For those involved who bought a house cheap and sold it expensive, good for them, and it was government policy. But I think it has had, all these years down the line, it's had some negatives. But for those involved, what a great opportunity. And if they bought it cheap, and I think the house that I'm in now is actually owned by the local authority, and I suspect I have right to buy on mine, and I may well do that at some future point.
Right. Okay, so what is your opinion of the miners' strike?
The miners' strike didn't have a direct impact on me, and I probably didn't understand it in terms of the impact that it had in Northumberland. I mean, the miners' strike for us in Alnwick was Shilbottle Pit, so Whittle and Shilbottle, I guess, and I guess towns like Amble and Shilbottle had a lot more coal impact back in the 80s. A lot of farmers and miners knew each other socially, and I think there's reasonably close bonds. But when I got involved with party politics later on, I always picked up a little bit that a lot of the politicians who tend to be Labour, who'd worked in mining and had clearly been very impacted by the miners' strike, kind of held that against everybody. So they would use phrases like, ye's lot, like, ye's never helped us lot during the miners' strike. And I'd go, are you sure? Because my opinion was that a lot of miners, they earned good money at the time. They worked very, very hard in very dangerous conditions, and did deserve good money. And they would spend their meat in the local business. They would spend their money on things like meat with the local butchers. And they were actually very good spenders. They earned well, they spent well, and actually they were really good for the local community, and often would buy a lot of meat, which helps farmers indirectly. So it wasn't till later on, well after the 80s, that I began to realise the impact on the communities, and arguably the cruelty of the decision. And the decision may have been right, it was the way that it was handled, and I think it could have been done with a bit more grace and understanding, and those communities could have been taken through a transition which was a little bit more caring and thoughtful. So the impact rolls on all these years later. Yeah.
What do you think of Margaret Thatcher?
I grew up, my grandmother was a Tory, so I remember probably in the late 70s, early 80s, stuffing conservative leaflets into envelopes in the cafe that comes to the very point opposite the banks in the middle of Alnwick, so next to George White's. office. So I remember as a child labour, those Tories, stuffing envelopes. And I became a Liberal, probably because of that, forced labour as a child. So Margaret Thatcher was very iconic. I thought she was brilliant in Spitting Image. Spitting Image was a big part of my... so I loved the caricaturing. The Falklands, I definitely remember where I was when HMS Sheffield was sunk, because I was on a school playing field. I think I was drinking a bottle of martini, but probably shouldn't have been, that particular night. So her role in the Falklands definitely has quite an impactful kind of positioning in how I see her as that strong leader. As somebody who went into politics and understands the impact that she had, I think like all great leaders, not tempted to say hero or villain, but there is no doubt about it that she did a lot of things that had very positive impacts, but she also did a lot of things that arguably created divisions in society that live on. And we now have Brexit as our major division, but back then the miners' strike, was a division. And forcing police officers, there's some good mining, plenty stories if you talk to people in southeast Northumberland of very well paid metropolitan coppers coming up and flashing the cash in people's faces, even houses arguably being burgled by some of the police officers. And some pretty horrible things, went on. And when you hear those stories, you think, yeah, that was unnecessarily cruel and strong, the way that she, chose to take that on. But as I say, for me in the 1980s, it's only latterly that I've understood some of the evidential facts that perhaps would colour my opinion. So at the time, we were probably protected from a lot of that.
You said in the pre-interview about some of the miners' wives
Yeah.
into politics. Can you tell us a bit about that?
I was a politician from 1997 to 2001, and what I discovered was there was some excellent, really strong local councillors who were at County Hall in Morpeth, who really had come out of the miners' strike. So the miners' strike, although virtually all the miners clearly were male, the wives played a really key role in feeding everybody and keeping the families together, in raising funds, and a lot of them became politically active because of the miners' strike. And Lynn Camsell and several other good friends that I have who are Labour councillors came from that time, and the miners' strike galvanised them, gave them a voice and gave them a cause to fight for, and those skills later went into straightforward party politics. So when the strike was over, they still had plenty to say on behalf of their communities. And so, like everything bad that happens, there's always some good things that come out of it. And those communities, the same as the rural communities, had a real sense of place. But with the mines going, they've been lost for 10 or 20 years, looking for a new purpose, really.
The shipyard. So, what do you think about her decision to close down the shipyards?
Again, the shipyards, my dad was really quite into all things engineering. So I remember he took me to a good train crash at Morpeth. I think that was the 70s though. So the train had crashed, so he thought it would be good to go and see the carnage afterwards. This is well after the people had been removed. But he also, I remember the launching of the SS, the SO Northumbria, which was launched from the Wallsend shipyards. So for me, as a rural person, the shipyards was something you saw a lot of on the news, and we'd occasionally go for the launch of particularly big ships. I remember going to Tynemouth to see the SO Northumbria actually sail out of the River Tyne. But it kind of wasn't kind of on our day-to-day radar during the 1980s. I do remember going to the Nissan plant and seeing the Nissan Bluebirds rolling off with a young farmer's trip. And 20-odd years later, I went back with a group of farmers and saw the Qashqai being produced. And I did say to the staff, I said, the last time I was here, you were making Bluebirds? I think some of the staff weren't actually born then, but there you go. But so yeah, changing times.
What did you think of the 80s, like looking back?
What did I think of the 80s? Um, it seemed to be quite a happening time, and I was an early adopter of things, so I probably had my first mobile phone right at the end of the 80s. I had my first Apple laptop computer back in the late 80s and early 90s. So it was a time when people like myself recognised that technology was definitely going to be part of a new future. I think I'd been blessed at having a kind of a more cosmopolitan view of the world than a lot of local people. People used to joke that Anik never saw boom and never saw bust because we were somewhat removed. There's a lovely phrase which I hope's worthy of being kept in. They used to say that for every mile north of Newcastle that you travel back one calendar year, which would have put Anik in the 80s, back in probably the late 40s or early 50s. And even now would put it kind of probably in the 90s. So that was quite true at the time. It was a kind of slightly old-fashioned, and I suspect some people come here for tourism because it reminds them of a slower-paced world. Tourists would always complain that it was too quiet. We had people on our holiday cottage, and we said, "Did you sleep?" You know, that slight worry. "Did you sleep okay last night?" "No," they would say. And you go, "Oh my God, why not?" It was too quiet. So we had a lot of things to offer in the 80s here that the rest of the country was beginning to lose. So it was quite unusual, but I think by the end of the 80s we were beginning to catch up. House prices suddenly moved up. Anik became one of the best places to live in the country. Another strange thing that happened, and it probably was in the 80s, the Duke died, Harry, and I've seen 3 Dukes died, I guess, two dying, one still alive. And when Harry died, Northumberland Estates only issued 2 press releases. And I remember hearing a story that the hacks in London had phoned up to get the story, and they said, "I'm terribly sorry, we only issued 2 press releases, one to the Times and one to the Northumberland Gazette." And it was kind of as if Anik was stuck in the 1880s, and these London journalists were going, "You're joking, we just want to copy the press release." And they were going, no, that's the way we do things. So I think in a way, the way that the Percys had such a strong hold and still do have an influence, but I think back in the day, hunting, all those things kind of gave it a slightly old-fashioned feel. And I think somehow, once we had a McDonald's in Anik, perhaps we caught up with the world.
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
Was that okay?
That was perfect.
That was excellent.
Okay.
Anything else you think of talking about you'd like to say?
Mobile phones, they're funny. It must have been about 89 that I probably did get my first mobile phone. For many people, I was the first person who ever had a mobile phone. And I remember going to a pub. The bar was 3 deep. I couldn't get served. Quick as a flash, I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll find out the landline number of this pub, because I could see the telephone at the bar. So I got my mobile out, and I rang the pub, and I went, "Could I have 2 pints of lager, please, and a packet of crisps?" And at the time, nobody had seen mobile phones. So it was that look as she's looking at the landline telephone, looking up into the crowd, and there's me with one of these newfangled phones. But just at the time, these things were, So it was, things like that, which you kind of look on. And now when I ring Vodafone and I'm trying to get a good deal, I kind of say to them, "Can you check just before you decide whether to give me a good deal or not, how long I've been a customer?" And they go, "Oh, we'll check that out." And now my contract is older than most of the staff who answer the phones, which I always think, it's only fair that I get a good deal as now, since I was one of those daft sods that paid £1,000 for a phone 20, 30 years ago. So,
So you said that you were a yuppie. What is a yuppie?
What's a yuppie? It was a kind of London name. So Sloane's, there was a book, and it was all about this country set who lived in London in a way. So it was quilted jackets. They all had names like Jemima, and they just had it was a really upper class. I guess Princess Diana was almost a yuppie. She was borderline. So they were OK Henrys, so very posh, probably went to boarding school. And I apologise for not having a Geordie accent, but I had a stammer when I was little. And when I went away to boarding school, my first nickname was Puddin'. So when I'd gone away to boarding school, I must have said, "Whoa, Ayman, what's for puddin'?" And they must have gone, "Oh, pudding, how funny, let's call him Puddin'." So my Puddin'. Puddin' was my first nickname. And equally, my son, who's currently Geordie, used to hate my posh friends when they used to ring the farmhouse. He'd go, "Oh, man, Dad, it's your posh friends on the phone again." And he got at me about travelling first class. He said, "Dad, why do you have to go in first class? Hoity-toity class? Like, who travels hoity-toity class?" I said, "Well, like, posh people. Like, the train's full of posh people in hoity-toity class." So there you go.
Brilliant. Laughing out loud.
I know.
Lovely bit of
Unprofessional behaviour, that laughing out
I
loud.
know, I'm so sorry. I'll have to keep that in